T'entends pas? Marc, tu es muté.
Monsieur Botting, on ne vous entend pas. Peut-être qu'il y a un souci de micro. Toujours pas.
Marqué un comme muté.
Do you hear me? You still don't hear me? Yes, you do hear me. Oh, I'm seeing people nodding. That's great. So I can start over again. Let me not use these then. Excellent. So I'll start over very shortly. So it's our second day today on this webinar, this series of webinars actually in two panels, which are, I think, extremely, well, I don't need to say that, but extremely timely, on how to make this vaccine into an accessible good for all and to all everywhere in the world, and the role the European Union can play in this. Now, this afternoon we will have two panels, one that we are starting in now on intellectual property rights, and one later that will be moderated by my colleague and MB member Petros Kokalis. So I'm a member of the left group, of course, in the European Parliament, but also of the Industry Committee, Industry and Research Committee of the European Parliament. Now, this being said, we will discuss IPR, so intellectual property rights. That sounds very unsexy, very, very unsexy. It is not. It is extremely important, and I think we have, over the last couple of weeks, months, seen why it is so important. One of the reasons is the availability of vaccines, the quantity of vaccines that can actually be produced. So Oxfam has recently shown us that, or estimated, that today we only use worldwide 43% of global production capacity for vaccines. Now that is less than half. Of course, this is an estimation, and I'm sure our guests today will go into that. And there was this story ran by Associated Press last week as well, where the press agency went to 3 different continents and found 3 factories that would be ready to produce vaccines, the current vaccines, if only they could get the right to do so, and the patent to do so, the technology, the know-how to do so. So this is actually a very interesting situation. I remember when we, with our group, asked the Commission before the summer to check on intellectual property rights, to check who would own the vaccine, who would own the technology. The Commission said, don't worry about this. This is not a problem. This makes no difference at all. We contested this, and I think we were right to do so. But obviously now the matter is, how do we make this happen? And what would, on the one hand, the importance be of such a move? How would we go about such a move? And thirdly, how can we make it happen? And therefore we invited 3 very knowledgeable and interesting speakers this afternoon, first of all. Let me start with David Hammerstein, who's joining us from Spain, and who is the co-founder of the Commons Network, and currently also a member, of course, of the European Alliance for Responsible Research and Development and Affordable Medicines. I will give then the floor to Penny Clark, who's also joining us from Brussels, but for EPSU, which is the European Public Services Union. And she's Deputy General Secretary of EPSU and Head of Policy, notably also for trade, if I'm right. And then finally, Julie Steendam is joining us, and Julie has been coordinating a European Citizens Initiative campaign around this, which is demanding, and I'm sure you will go into this, Julie, which is demanding to make the vaccine a common public good and try to lift intellectual property limitation on this vaccine by putting up pressure on the European Commission. So these are our three invited guests for this afternoon. They will each speak between 15 and 20 minutes. And the idea would be ask questions. So when there's a, so I would invite you to use it, ask questions, read your remarks, and try to get them to the end. We will have a little bit more.
Marc, je suis désolé de t'interrompre, mais
Mr. Hammerstein,
on ne comprend pas vraiment ce que tu dis. Il y a vraiment des soucis techniques.
Mr. Hammerstein, but then I will give the floor to David Hammerstein immediately for his introduction.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hello? Okay, I'm sorry, since I couldn't hear Mark, I was in times. Nevertheless, the European Union has not taken exceptional measures in order to assure access to knowledge and technology in this regard. In this sense, there's an English expression that says the chickens have come home to roost, which means we are paying for all of our past legislative normative measures where we have constructed a dense spider web where we are all tied up in the spider web of laws, from everything from trade secrets to international agreements to the whole intellectual property rights framework, plus how we deal with public investments, EU and member state investments in research and science, how our academic and universities act and interact with the production of knowledge with private companies, et cetera, non-disclosure acts, public contract law about how the details of public contracts are created and how you cannot disclose that information. All of these issues have created a very dense web where it's very difficult to take these exceptional measures. Now, why do we need these exceptional measures? It's pretty obvious at this point, at least to deal with the vaccine. There are many other issues where we'd have to take exceptional measures. We took exceptional measures on a global scale, for example, to face HIV/AIDS and to prevent millions of deaths towards the intellectual property rights to make access to these medicines accessible. And why is this happening? Why is this happening? Let's talk about the framework, the ideological framework, then some of the structural issues, and then we'll get in very quickly into the more technical political issues, and I will end with what is to be done. What do we have to do? We live in an upside down world where our values and morality have been pretty perversely inverted and corrupted. What is really scarce, for example, are ecosystems of water, earth, forests, lots of minerals, has been subjected by the economy and opened up to unlimited extraction, overexploitation, precisely, which is one of the underlying causes of our COVID-19 pandemic, which is the zoonoses, our over exploitation of the commons and extraction has led to that. So what is really limited has been treated as if it were very, very abundant. At the same time, what is absolutely abundant and limitless, For example, knowledge, scientific information that cannot be depleted like a forest. This has been limited by the spider web I spoke about before. Our scientific knowledge and know-how has been enclosed by intellectual property rules, trade secret laws, non-disclosure terms, and an endless series of regulations that artificially enclose and privatize what is abundant, making what we call artificial scarcity, or what we also call the tragedy of the anti-commons. So science and technology, all the way from our universities to big corporations, has been isolated from the value and the morality of the common good. So facts and values have been amputated from each other for the sake of market access, fast science, etc. So this artificial scarcity of knowledge and technology is the tragedy of the anti-commons, and in this political maze of enclosure, and what we might call today vaccine apartheid. I think the other speakers will go into much greater detail of how this apartheid is happening, how much of the world is not having access to vaccines. And when you turn on the television, now we hear they're even speaking of vaccine passports, which is really scientifically, morally, and politically pretty obscene, because if we talk about vaccine apartheid, now we're going to have to talk about vaccine Bantustans, where the people who don't have access to the vaccines will live in parts of the world, vast section of the world's population that will not have that vaccine passport to be able to go. So in many ways, this is a deepening of a shock doctrine in action, where when these vaccines, maybe in 1 year, 2 years' time, actually reach much of the world's population, they might even be obsolete or of little use due to all of the new strains of COVID that are coming out. So how do we get into this tragic mess, and how can we get out of this tragic mess? Dr. Tedros of the World Health Organization paraphrases a phrase from, I think it's from the Old Testament, where he says, if not now, when? If we're in exceptional circumstances of a global pandemic, why can we not have exceptional measures? What would the exceptional measures be? The exceptional measures would be prioritize the creation of public goods. And with massive public investment, where we've had billions of public investment from the EU and its member states, from the United States and other, it would be a question of putting very clear conditions that we are participants as the public, as citizenry, of the intellectual property that is being created by our public universities, our public investments, and they cannot be enclosed, in this case, in this tragedy of the anti-commons, by private companies as we see today. We have been, and I've said this before, stupid or idiotic capital investors or risk investors. We've invested our money to get a vaccine, but the profits and the way it's being used are decided and are hijacked by the pharmaceutical companies. We're in a situation that's extremely dangerous today with COVID-19, but at the same time, we must prepare for the next pandemic, the next, which is, according to many scientists, could be quite soon. And the underlying causes have not even been considered. So we haven't like I mentioned, we haven't considered the underlying environmental causes, which basically are forcing the viruses to look for refuge in human beings when they should remain in nature. Obviously, the globalization. We haven't dealt with the very lack of governance of global health, where we have a WHO, which is financed in many degrees by private philanthropy, nor have we worried about universal health care. So we haven't dealt with an academic system which is dominated by fast science. What is fast science? It's to make technological transfer, as understood as market access, as fast as possible. So our scientists, more and more, and our academics are trained in competition and not in cooperation. We've even seen that peer review for academic advance, for becoming a doctorate, is many countries even being eliminated and being substituted for access to just a few academic journals. So governments in the European Union is impotent to act unless we exceptionally suspend or change laws. And we cannot just deal with end of the pipe solutions. We cannot just deal with the pandemic and say, well, how are we going to make as fast as possible these vaccines and get them out and have an effective rollout? We know that there are factories and places to produce massively vaccines, even in 3 or 4 months, produce 10, 15, 20 billion vaccines. This is possible. Why is that not happening? It's not happening because it's taboo politically, totally taboo, as Mark mentioned before, to even mention the causes or the structural reasons for our poor public health response to COVID-19. So how can we get out of this mess? As E.P. Thompson said many years ago during nuclear deployment, protest and survive. I'm very happy that 115 MEPs have demanded of the European Commission and the Council to stop blocking the intellectual property waiver for COVID-19 vaccines and technology in the World Trade Organization. This is the way to get them. How did we get a change in the policy on HIV/AIDS medicines? Well, it was easier because we didn't have the COVID-19 pandemic to go out into the streets and to block, but we need to do that now. I'll give an example of something on a much lower level that is not exactly life and death, but I worked for many years to get an exception to intellectual property rights for access to books for blind people. Some of you will know the Marrakesh Treaty. It took over 5 years of pressure. The European Commission, the European Council, for years and years said, we want voluntary measures, we could use charity. The same discourse as they're giving today. We will use COVAX. People will donate their excess vaccines, or we will have voluntary licenses. This will not work. Charity will never establish a right nor make changes to respond to exceptional situations. They could help, but we could see, and every time when there's more pressure for demanding a waiver of patents, I see that many of the large countries increase their donation to COVAX. They increase their donation for a charity philanthropy way of dealing with this crisis. This will not work for many, many reasons, because the voluntary licenses that are conceded by the pharmaceutical companies have many, many conditions. There cannot be parallel trade. They cannot, the people living in the country across the border cannot access these vaccines. Even often there are conditions of lack of transparency. So how can we start changing this? One of the ways of changing this is to get access to the real, what is happening, what is being paid, what are the conditions of the contracts, what are the real clinical data that has been created by the pharmaceutical countries. We've created, many people have asked for this. There's been a scandal in the European Parliament about the lack of transparency. We, in the name of an organization, the Commons Network, and also No Gracias in Spain of critical doctors, on the 22nd of this month, we will be testifying before the Petitions Committee on a petition for transparency and access to the COVID-19 vaccines. But we need to demand responsibility of our political representatives. They cannot continue with this double talk that everything is compatible. Our system is compatible of giving monopoly exclusivity to the pharmaceutical companies is compatible with access. It is not, and it is morally bankrupt. It is a moral catastrophe, how Dr. Tedros has said. we need to make a stronger alliance with these 115 MEPs, but also on a national level. For example, I'm in Spain, and Pedro Sanchez and his ministers say, oh, they're very worried about solidarity with everyone getting a vaccine. Unless everyone is safe, no one is safe. But then they go to the council meetings and they do not say one word against the council and the commission position in the World Trade Organization against a waiver of IP. So there's a tremendous amount of hypocrisy, and that could only be broken by political pressure. And I don't know how we're going to do it, having to maintain social distance, but if I were in Brussels now, maybe we need to do like Greta Thunberg and chain ourselves and have a sit down in front of the European Commission, in front of the Council, and do it every day. Unless we go out into the streets, unless we create a political crisis, these changes are not going to be made. And we need to establish a precedent, because this kind of crisis, whether it be like it was with AIDS or with hepatitis C, where millions of people have died because of lack of access, is going to happen again and again. And in the context of the climate emergency, in the context of this pandemic and coming pandemics because of structural problems of how we eat, massive animal husbandry, which results in zoonosis as well, we're going to face this problem more and more. This is a question of survival. It's a question of survival of, we have to treat knowledge, technology, as well as nature as a commons. A greedy gene is not going to get us out of this crisis like it's not going to get it out of other crises. And we've seen that even the Green New Deal in the last year has been turned into a Screen New Deal, which has meant that the control over much of what we buy and eat and the exploitation of our personal data is going to giant digital platforms. This is a very, very, very big mess, because it means the enclosure and the exploitation and extractivism getting into our biology, our cells, our health, and we have to take it back. And that means declaring vaccines a public good. I know that the head of the European Commission called it a global public good, and then has done everything possible to enclose it and to make it and to privatize it, which is tremendous hypocrisy. And we have to recover the commons of knowledge, of data, and a sovereignty of us for the common good. And there's no common good as great as global health. And this has to be in the first word we have all the time. And we have to call out to our leaders and say, we cannot take these facts and this data and separate them from value and morality. And recovering the vaccines as a global public good is the best way to fight for that global commons. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. My connection is slightly better. Imagine the European Parliament not being able to deal with Zoom. That is wonderful. I would like to thank you, David, for insisting also on the transparency aspect, which is obviously extremely important and which we will deal with in a greater extent also in the panel after this one, chaired by Petros. But I would like to give the floor now to Penny Clark from EPSU, who will also, and I think this is interesting because you come from a public services union, why this interest in vaccines and this mobilization around it? Why is that also extremely important for trade unions? I think that's also an interesting question, because we have seen trade unions being active on this throughout Europe. In France, in Italy, in Belgium, and so on. So I think that is extremely enriching to get your perspective on this. Thank you very much. Penny Clark.
Thank you. I hope this is coming across okay. It's very nice to be here, and to start right where you asked, Mark. Of course, we are interested because we agree with what has just been said by David, that public health is the first of the common goods, and COVID gives us an opportunity maybe to, well, to use another expression from David, the chickens have come back to roost, to maybe start pushing the chickens back again, because indeed COVID is a game changer in our view. In a way, we thought that the 2008 crisis was also going to give more opportunities to question all the things which we've heard in the introduction and during these 2 days about the wrong priorities, and putting back, as we want, you know, people and planet above profit, to have a proper social and green transition, which really, yeah, undoes the damage and puts us on a much better track. So that's the interest. And as you said, we are a public service union, so we are close to people. We provide public services to people, and we know that you can't have good public services unless you have good staff, enough staff, and we have terrible staff shortages in health and social care, and that you put people first. So we are full and fully with this campaign, and with Public Services International, which is EPSU's global federation. We have also been organizing events and actions and lobbying to try, first and foremost, to have the waiver for the TRIPS agreement, which we went in a very good session yesterday in this event, and to keep up the pressure to make indeed the vaccines as a common good. In fact, I want to start there perhaps because it was said that the Commission and many others have talked a lot about solidarity, and they've mentioned that vaccines are a common good and that they want to provide vaccines to everybody and to have this solidarity. But as has been said, often this remains at words and not in actions. So I thought it'd be interesting to just to remind you and remind us that we do have certain, we have certain things that we can build on. If we really want to change the future priorities, it's good sometimes to look back and see what our own governments and parliament and ministers have said about public services and public health and the need to put public health first. So I give just a couple of examples. One is from already 2006, and these were joint conclusions from all the EU governments, in which they said the overarching values of universality, access to good quality care, equity, and solidarity are widely accepted in the work of the different EU institutions. Together, this constitutes a set of values that are shared across Europe. Another small example I take from the 2014 joint report from the European Commission and the Social Protection Committee, which is made up of all the different governments. And here it said that social protection against the risks of dependency on long-term care, in other words, the need for social care for older people, is needed both for equity and for efficiency grounds. Yeah, so they recognize that the systems need to incorporate the need for long-term care as a risk to be met through the social protection public systems. And then even last week, the Council conclusions from the 25th of February, they talk a lot about human rights. Human rights are universal, indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated. And there are two things specifically on the vaccine. It calls for immunization against COVID-19 as a global public good and to ensure timely, fair, and equitable access to safe and affordable, effective vaccines, therapeutic, and diagnostics. And the Council conclusions also mention that universal health coverage, access to water, hygiene, sanitation is important, and inclusive and non-discriminatory approaches to public health are needed. So we have the words, they've been written, but they're not in, if you like, a regulatory framework. When David mentioned the spider web of the different rules that protect investors and which make it difficult to see what the economy is really doing, these rules have not been made to protect and promote public services, at least not at European level yet. And we need them. And trade unions and indeed employers in health and social care services, in EPSU, we have a social dialogue with the hospital sector, HOSPIM, and the social services employers. We are developing also a dialogue. They share this approach that we are putting forward. So we would argue that we have the political support, indeed, across all the political parties. So you might wonder, why does only 150 MEPs sign the letter on the waiver, when I think we could say that really everybody can sign up to the idea that public health should be first and solidarity should be first, and that we need to have the rules and regulations, not just the words, that will help us to deliver this. Today, I think the European Pillar of Social Rights Action Plan will be published, and there we're looking very much forward to this implementation of the Principle 16, which calls for timely access to affordable, preventive and curative health care of good quality. And there I'll just take a couple of sentences to say that, of course, preventive and curative health care are not equal. Cures are always very important, and healthcare treatment is, of course, absolutely vital. But the prevention, the promotion of good health is the starting point. The systems have to also tackle, well, lack of water and sanitation in many countries is still a big problem, less in Europe, but inequalities, poor housing, poor education, all these things determine health outcomes. Some of you may have seen last week new figures from the United States on mortality, which shows that Black men in the US lost 3 years in terms of mortality last year due to COVID. Some of this is the direct impact of COVID, but much, of course, is this unequal society and unequal impacts on, particularly in this case, Black men. So if we want to have affordable and accessible healthcare for all, as I said, this needs to be regulated, because how can it be affordable and accessible if we only depend on market mechanisms? So we need the regulation. And I know Mark at the beginning said IPR is not the most attractive of issues, but as this panel is looking at IPR, I think it is worth recalling one of the basis of IPR as we have it today. And for that, I'm just going to share with you a little bit of text from the Commission homepage under the industrial part of the Commission's website, where it talks about IPR and where it says that IPR plays an important role in promoting innovation and protecting investment. Then it says IPR is the best way, not the only way, but the best way to harness creativity and to enable innovative enterprises to grow. And that without the protection of ideas, businesses and individuals would not reap the full benefits of their inventions and creations. This was touched on already, but in a way, if you think about this phrase, it has lots of assumptions, doesn't it? You know, it has assumptions that individuals create on their own, but this has nothing to do with their education system or the way they're brought up or the sharing of knowledge, the cooperation with other scientists. You know, that this is a very specific process, and that it belongs to them. You know, that workers who may be in these businesses have not been involved, or other actors. So I think, indeed, the intellectual property right framework needs to be addressed. In a way, when it was first introduced in many countries, it was never the idea that it would become all exclusive and all protective. It was always the idea that you would, in a sense, limit IPR, because, as has been said very well, knowledge should have no limits. And when we try and put limits on it, this only backfires. we made a statement to the Commission's consultation on the pharmaceutical strategy, which I can put the link in the chat to save time, where we make a number of demands how we think that the pharmaceutical strategy could be improved, not least by greater transparency and by addressing the price controls and the IPR, but also to have a stronger role for the public sector. Here, EPSU is not alone. And just to cite one other scholar, whose name is, I'll just get it for you, Massimo Florio. I can also put the link, an interesting paper where he also argues for basically public sector organizations, a bit like we have with the European Space Agency or the CERN, the nuclear energy, to actually develop drugs and maybe produce drugs, and to be an alternative to private sector, not to replace private sector, but to be an alternative to private sector companies, and to make sure that we do have drugs being developed in areas that we actually need them. And he gives the example, Mr. Florio, of the lack of clinical trials in the COVID type viruses, and points out there were only actually 6 trials in all the years after SARS from 2003. There were actually only 6 clinical trials up until 2019. So clearly there is, you know, a lack of interest in pharmaceutical companies in certain areas where we actually do need to have the innovation and the developments of drugs and therapeutics, which are not being provided at the moment. I think I'll stop by saying that when we are discussing together about what we can do, how to build the pressure to make the change and what we want, certainly the European Parliament, our trade union affiliates and civil society organizations across Europe, and our global organizations, we all play a key role in shifting and getting political support for the change. But I would end by saying that first and foremost, this change has to be about putting public health and good health outcomes first, you know, because we can have a lot of different initiatives, but they have to fit into a joint vision of how we want to shape our healthcare systems. And as I said, not just the curative aspects, but the preventive aspects, and do that in a way where we do have equality of treatment and equality of outcomes. And I would thank you very much for your attention, and happy to answer questions and join in the chat later.
Thank you very much, Penny. In the meanwhile, I have tried to improve on the connection, but unfortunately, this is not in my hands. But thank you very much, Penny Clark, for EPSU, and some good points indeed as well on the future and the pharmaceutical strategy. This is certainly something to look at from different committees. And to see how we can bring about the change we need. And I think in that regard, David already spoke about the petition that will be discussed at the Petty committee, the petitions committee. And of course, there's the mobilization of the European Citizens Initiative, which I think is also a tool which is important. And I am sure that Julie Steendam will explain all the technicalities and the necessities of this. So I would propose to go immediately to Julie from the ECI, Right to Cure No Profit on Pandemic. Also for 15 to 20 minutes, please, Julie. And then we will go over to the question and answer session. And in the end, we will have the pleasure, as I said, to have Petros Kokalis, who will conclude this panel and draw some conclusions. Please, Julie, the floor is yours.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Just a quick sound check if this sounds well. Okay, I can see you nodding. Okay, I will try to do some screen sharing as well. Just a minute. Okay, now you will see yourself, but I'm switching to my presentation. This should work now. Okay, so good afternoon. Indeed, I'm Julie Steendam, and I'm here to talk about the European Citizens Initiative, Right to Cure, No Profit on Pandemic. This is a campaign, a petition campaign that was launched on 30th of November last year. And until now, we are already a coalition of over 200 European civil society organizations of over 14 European countries, which is quite impressive. And our aim is exactly what we have been talking about and which has been greatly presented by the previous speakers. Our aim is to make the vaccine and treatments and all needed technologies to fight this pandemic a public common good, not in the hands of private companies, but available to all. And our ambition to do so is by mobilizing citizens, by working together with civil society and also with political groups. But now let's just get quickly back to the basics. Why did we start this initiative? Indeed, as has been said by the previous speakers, we had a promise. Back in April, the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, said, and was a great moment of collective hope, I guess. She said that the vaccine will be our universal common good. This was great to hear. But as we kind of see, this is how it started. And right now we are in the how it's going situation. The vaccine is there, which is impressive. But we can see that this distribution of this promise of universal common global access is not maintained at all. We can see an enormous unequal access in who will get the vaccine and where. And this is on a global scale. So we kind of have to get back to how did we get here, or where did we go wrong? So when the President von der Leyen made a statement, this was during a council together with other global leaders, World Health Organizations, in which the European Commission also pledged and started looking for money for public investments to accelerate the research and the development of this much needed vaccines. This is a bit the overview what we can see on the left. And this has been highlighted lots of times, but I think it's our main and most important argument. The vaccine has been developed majorly by public funding. It has been paid for by the public, has been paid for by taxpayers' money, by citizens. So why should we now be again negotiating if we and how should get access to it? As you can see in this table on the left, we are really talking about billions of public money that have been used for these vaccines, which was without any doubt necessary. Now on the right, we can also see the situation today, which is an estimation. But now that we have the vaccine, we are seeing different prices coming up. There's different types of vaccines that have been approved, but we also see that not everyone is paying the same amount for it. And this is also a basic principle. We shouldn't be just happy that the vaccine is there. We also should ask ourselves the question, how much are we paying for these? Because as we can see on the left, as a public, we already invested majorly in development of the vaccine, and now we are actually paying a second time to buy these vaccines. And it's quite high prices, as we can tell. And to make the situation even more complex, we can actually already see that not every country is paying the same amount of money. Like some countries, namely South Africa, Mexico, Brazil, and Uganda, it has come out that they are actually paying more per doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine than European countries are doing. So something is going quite wrong. And now, indeed, let's get back to what is going wrong. As the People's Vaccine Alliance, which has done incredible work in bringing out these numbers, has calculated, we are actually in an artificial shortage situation of vaccines. There's not enough vaccines to provide the whole world, and not even in Europe, we cannot maintain the vaccination programs that were set up. There are delays in delivery, and we have to make difficult decisions every day on who we want to vaccinate first or who should get priority. We are hearing arguments all the time, okay, it's complex and our production capacity is limited, but this is something that can be fixed. Indeed, as has been said, if we lift the intellectual property rights, other production centers in the rest of the world would be authorized to also produce the vaccine at a lower cost and at a faster rate. And actually today, only the 3 biggest vaccine corporations are producing enough vaccines for only 1.5% of the global population. And this is not only problematic from an ethical point of view, also from a medical point of view. It doesn't make any sense to start vaccinating Europeans, Americans, richer parts of the world first. Because what we see now is we have new variants of the virus coming up. And if we give these variants a free play in other parts of the world, it's also a threat for our situation. And basically any efforts that we did in the past year, the big efforts that we did, will all be for nothing. So it's crucial that if we talk about vaccination and distribution globally, this is from a medical perspective and an ethical perspective. And secondly, to make this all even more worrying, what we can also see is that those vaccine companies companies, the pharmaceutical companies, that only this year. Now, what can the European Commission do about it? Right? Takes us back to what happened or where it went wrong. I think the European Commission in the beginning, they got the authority to negotiate as a group, which is a good thing, I guess. But they did it in a way, in business as usual way. They gave money to private companies, asked them to make the vaccine, but also granted monopolies, patent rights. And this is a business as usual. A company gets a patent right, gets the intellectual property right to develop the vaccine, to produce it, to set the pricing, to decide on transparency, but then also gets to decide on the rate, the fastness of the production, and who gets what and when at what price. But of course, we are not in a business as usual situation. We're in the midst of a pandemic where we need access to vaccines as fast as possible and in the most equal way as possible. And this doesn't seem to get in the head of the European Commission. We need to have a radical change of approach as to what has been done before. And the good thing is there are already rules at the international level that can grant this. And it has been mentioned before several times. At the World Trade Organization, there was a proposal to temporarily lift intellectual property rights during the pandemic as to make the vaccine available at a faster rate for everyone. This proposal was discussed yesterday during the General Council, and it will be discussed again on the 10th and 11th of March during TRIPS Council. It already has the support of over 19 countries globally. African Union has supported it, several global leaders, over 400 civil society organizations have asked to support this issue, but still United States and European Commission are blocking it. And of course, this is not a coincidence. This is the regions of the world where those pharmaceutical companies are based, and by no doubt are putting lots of pressure on the policymakers to block this proposal. So to sum up a bit, the European Commission has the tools. We have a shortage. We're in the midst of an amazing, incredible social, health, mental, economical crisis. And there's a simple solution, like hand out the recipe, share the information that we have, make sure that production can be speed up and that we can get out of this pandemic as fast as possible. But what has been the answer of the European Commission when they heard that there's not enough vaccines to even vaccinate the European population? They said, okay, then let's have an export restriction and keep all the vaccines for ourselves. So this is, I think, one of the examples that the European Commission wants to show a bit of muscles, as opposed to the pharmaceutical companies, but they are actually completely missing out to the solution that we need, which is to end or limit intellectual property rights. So I guess we all agree this is a business as usual situation, but we need to drastically change the scenario. And to do that, we need massive mobilization. We need to put pressure on the European Commission so that they will limit intellectual property rights. And there's not much that we can do, or we might feel that there's not much that we can do during a lockdown, but this is not entirely true. This is why we launched the Citizens Initiative. And this is actually a legislative democratic tool that the European Commission developed itself to grant citizens and civil society the possibility to address itself directly to the Commission. The basic principle is that it's petition, but it has a direct impact. And we need 1 million signatures, which is not little, but I'm sure with all the support and the consensus that there already is there, that this is achievable. So once we have 1 million signatures to support our demands, the European Commission is obliged to respond to what we are asking for. Our demands, it's a bit a repetition of what the past speaker said, but of course we want health for all, which means that the vaccine should be available to everyone globally. Also, we need transparency. The European Commission has the competency to demand that to the pharmaceutical companies that received public money for the vaccines, for any other type of pharmaceutical product, that they be transparent about their clinical data, the production costs, the price that they pay that they ask per doses, and also how they plan to do their distribution. Thirdly, public money, public control. We need to have this vaccine in our hands. We need to decide who gets to produce it and how, and this shouldn't be a decision of private companies alone. And fourthly, no profit on pandemic. This is a basic thing. Why should we allow to give away billions of public money to shareholders of private companies? This is money that we need for our social system, social security, health systems, mental health. There are lots of needs that we can sum up that are more urgent than another excessive profit for those shareholders. So this is what we are demanding, and we are getting there. As of today, we are already at 90,000, over 19,000 signatures. We need a massive boost for sure to get to this 1 million. But now that we have the debate ongoing on intellectual property rights, it should be achievable. So please, if you're listening, help us out. Go to the website, noprofitonpandemic.eu, share the link with your family, friends, ask them to sign. And of course, write to your MEPs, ask them to support as well. Go to your local trade union, to civil society organizations, so we can broaden up our coalition and give this campaign a massive boost. And I'm happy that David already gave the suggestion that we should go maybe block the European Commission. We didn't go so far yet, but we already start mobilizing in the streets as well. We were in front of the European Commission last week, where we did a flash mob. And it was quite good to get in the streets again. And I put the other picture. This was not us. This was a mass mobilization during the AIDS pandemic, the HIV crisis in South Africa. But it's very inspirational because the whole context really resonates with what we are experiencing right now, where people do not have access to life-saving treatments because pharmaceutical companies refuse to share their knowledge. But it was thanks to mass mobilizations that they were obliged to do so, that now we have rules inside of the World Trade Organization, like to have those patent waivers. So this is what we need. We need to put pressure. We need to mobilize as citizens, as civil society, as political parties, and make sure that we get out of this crisis. Let me stop screen sharing and get back to you. Okay, this is mainly what I wanted to present. So happy to hear if there's any questions, and also to hear the concluding parts of this webinar.
thank you, Julie, for this interesting overview as well. I hope my sound is still okay. So we now have time for questions and answers, a little bit time. I don't know if there's questions and answers. I'm now looking in the chat panel. I don't see immediately any there. I received 3 through Facebook, which I would be happy to, if you agree, while we wait for other answers or other questions, which I would be happy to ask the panelists. So I will put them here now. If there are other coming in, of course, and if we have time, we will be happy to deal with them. The first one is a short one saying companies have already shared intellectual property rights. I'm not sure where the information comes from. I guess it might be about Moderna saying they will not enforce. But anyway, if you have any comment on this, that companies would already have shared it. A second one is indeed what the Commission said, and I think Penny Clark already referred to this, on the importance of innovation. Is there not a risk for innovation? David also mentioned it, if I'm not wrong. So if you have any comment on this. And then, the final one, which I put in my introduction, so I get it comes from there, is how realistic is it that by lifting IPR rights, so intellectual property rights, we would actually scale up production fast? Do we have any proof of that? So maybe first, David Hammerstein.
Yes, we do have proof. In fact, the Moderna vaccine is being produced by the Serum Institute in India, and that need not just to lift the intellectual property rights or give them rights, but to share the know-how. So what we're talking about is that enable to produce the vaccines, we need to have the IP, but also we need to know how the process to making the vaccine. Now, the ARN vaccines, which is basically the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine, are apparently the industrial process is quite easy and it's not complicated for many. I've seen there maybe 15 or 20 factories that could produce this vaccine around the world. And some estimates are between 10, 15, and 20 billion of these vaccines could be made, produced in 3, 4, 5, 6 months. So that's one thing. So we have the know-how, we have the patents. The question of the innovation is that when you lift the intellectual property rights, it doesn't mean they're not going to recover their investment. In fact, it is estimated that this year Pfizer will have made $20 billion on with its vaccine. And I don't know, the other companies are also going to make a great deal of money. They're not going to lose money at all in this case. And as well, if we give out the intellectual property rights in many ways, there could be a very small profit. But since the volume, the scale is all of humanity, even a very, very small margin of profit would be a lot of money, which I even think would be too much. So we're talking about a situation where the technical problems about sharing this are not. The innovation, given the great deal of public investment, needs to revert back into public goods. So it's like you and I have been investing in these pharma companies, and we should be having shares over this property, and we don't have any of shares. It's been hijacked. So I think the innovation, just like so many other things, with HIV/AIDS, with hepatitis C, no company has lost money on these drugs after they have been shared. Totally the opposite. So I don't think we should shed any crocodile tears about that. And the innovation is taking place mainly the basic research in public institutions, in public universities. What we should not do is let this to be extracted and exploited by the private companies, but we're acting to the public good. So I think this is possible, but we have to break the ideological stronghold and the legal stronghold we have in these exceptional times.
Thank you very much, David. I have an additional question as well for Julie on the 1.5% capacity of the three major companies. So maybe Julie, in your answer, you can take that with you as well. But let me first go to Penny Clark again from EPSU with the same questions that were raised. They were not raised to anyone specifically, so I'm putting them for all of you together.
I just follow on from what David said. I thought it was interesting, actually, that the questions show how the business interests in the debate predominate many of the worries that people have. No, we many other groups can be facing kind of uncertainty and or have their pension rights cut or unemployed, and it doesn't seem to get as much. Doesn't seem to make as much concern in the media that somehow, if the patents would be a little bit affected, that you'd have the business sector suffering, and that we're asked to share this concern. So I think the questions themselves show the power of the ideology, that we're actually worrying about their lost profits maybe at a time when there are so many other things to worry about. And indeed, it would be really good to hear from the pharmaceutical industry that actually they're foregoing profits for the moment, and that they maybe even would like us to have a moratorium on future patents for the length of the COVID crisis, so that all the upcoming drugs which we will be developing will be patent free. I think that this is the type of thing that would be good, and that they are building in affordability and accessibility also into the new treatments, so that they're actually going to be even better and more effective and more easily we'll be all more able to produce them quickly. So that I think is all really important. I would just add one word maybe on the innovation, which comes up in many different areas at the moment in different discussions. But innovation is a neutral term when you think about it. I mean, you can innovate for good and you can innovate for things which are not good. And the fact that we always give it a value, or in the IPR, that it has to be something positive, I think is a problem in itself. And that what we would like to see is more innovation, which is particularly geared to solving people's problems. So innovation to deal with climate change, innovation to deal with public health, innovation to provide good cures for people, rather than emphasis on just innovation as in itself something which is going to deliver, because it's not necessarily going to deliver. So I would add that to the discussion. But I think a moratorium on patents for and the sharing of know-how, which was also said yesterday very well in the panel with the speakers on TRIPS, that it's not just obviously the patents. And I would add, as a healthcare worker, we also would need the staff and the people, qualified people to manage, the treatments in themselves, and the technology is not going to get it to people. You need to have healthcare workers, doctors, nurses, social care assistants, and other types of workers who will actually be able to make the link and deliver these treatments to people that need them. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that reply. And then I would give the floor to Julie for the same questions, and one the additional one about the 1.5% number regarding the production capacities of the three main, let's say, vaccine producing companies.
Yeah, I think I agree with what has been said. The whole argument that the limited production capacity or competences of in other parts of the world just doesn't make any sense. It's not an argument at all to not lift patent rights. It's actually almost a colonial thought, I would say, to think that other parts of the world do not have the competencies of capacities to make these kinds of vaccines. It's simply not true. I think mainly Pfizer is using this argument because they are using the new mRNA technology. It's also new for them. Like 1 year ago, they weren't as well not producing this type of vaccine. And anyhow, if this would be the case, then I think it's just an extra argument for more global collaboration. And patent rights are at this moment an obstacle to do so. We need to reinforce each other, both the production capacities in Europe as in other parts of the world, to make these types of vaccines, to accelerate it and get out of this pandemic more fast than is happening at the moment. And I think specifically on what has been mentioned, this 1.5 number, this is a number that was calculated by the People's Vaccine Alliance to actually show that there is massive production capacity in the world, but that we are just not using it. If even just the 3 of the biggest pharmaceutical companies with the biggest capacity are not working day and night to make this vaccine, there's something going wrong. Of course, they're making other products that are necessary as well. There's definitely some more space to speed up this production process. But at the moment, they are just not allowed to do it because they don't have the authority, or they're not allowed to do it because they do not own the patent rights that exist. So these 3 corporations are not the ones that already have developed one of the vaccines that got the authorization, but that are producing other types of vaccines, so that do have the capacity to make them. Yeah.
Thank you, Julie. I have not gotten any other questions. So that means I think that we can conclude the seminar by, and I would like to invite my colleague Petros Kokalis from the ENVI committee as well to take the honors for some lessons learned and some conclusions. And I would also on my behalf like to thank you for our 3 speakers and the people that asked the questions for your very interesting contributions.
Thank you.
Well, hello from me too. Good evening, and thank you. I would like to thank in my turn all the speakers for a very interesting presentations and a very thought-provoking discussions, and also for the more concrete suggestions about what to do. Especially, I'm referring to David's idea that we should bring into the plenary the transparency issue about how is the position of the Council on the TRIPS waiver arrived to and where its country stands. And this is a good point to break out this black box. I think that all this discussion is about lessons learned and whether we are going to learn the lesson of this pandemic and talk about the underlying causes, the real causes, which are very clearly going to bring us again and again in the face of such catastrophic events. This continued, well, let's put it that way. In the past 40 years of neoliberal privatization and extreme extraction of natural resources has shown us that not only this pandemic is not going to be the last, we're going to have more and more pandemics. We started in the past 20 years with the increase zoonotic events, which increase in decrease in periodicity and increase in extremity. They become more severe. So this, of course, reminds us of what's happening with extreme weather in the other and mother of all crisis, the climate crisis, which of course has no vaccine. So now, as we've been talking about the vaccine, and we're scrambling, we're spending a year to find this vaccine, which is a tremendous achievement, scientific achievement. But we must realize that this vaccine is not the end of the story. So I would like to pick up on Penny's discussion about preventive health and public health, and I think it's clear that the increased inequality that has risen dramatically in the past decades has both within the richest countries and as far as the less developed countries are concerned, is a clear indicator that now all these decades of following the mantra of this fiction of within our own bodies, much like David suggested. So now it's a time to learn the lesson and move forward. We have to think a little bit, we have to think always bigger and remind ourselves that it was only as a result of the previous global pandemic, the Spanish flu, that public health became the business of the state. That it was the time where we had the development of the social security system in the United States of America, the national health system in Britain, and of course, and this is very didactical right moment, we had the development of the German system of public health, which of course very soon was used in a much more sinister way. So now we are at a crossroads as we are still in this pandemic, and we can arrive at very different endpoints depending on how we carry forward our political fight, our political struggle. We can arrive at a place where we have more public health, more public services, more investment in health, in education, in social services, or we can arrive at a place where we have more surveillance, less workers' rights, less political rights, and these are both at this point possibilities, and we have to struggle for a state of more democracy, not less democracy. So as David said about the exceptional measures, and we have had a discussion, a public discussion, that we are at war with an invisible enemy. Well, during wartime, we do take exceptional measures, and we have taken exceptional measures now. We have moved into the limitation of political rights, which would be unheard of in the lockdowns, let's say the absolute right of the police to check on everybody on the street preemptively. So we have taken these exceptional measures, and it's really an ideological taboo that we're not taking them with the critical issue of the intellectual property rights, which there's no doubt that it would multiply our productive capabilities, especially as we see now that the predictions are for the lower income countries to get vaccines by 2023 and 2024, which of course makes no sense, because by that time we would have allowed all the variants to multiply, and therefore it's really self-defeating. The purpose is self-defeating. So this move we should be waiting. We should be focusing on the 10th and 11th of March discussion on the WTO on the TRIPS waiver. This is a very critical and very crucial point to show that we're moving towards a world where we have learned the lesson of the pandemic, and we are not somehow collectively sleepwalking towards our own self-destruction. So thank you all for this very informative and interesting discussion. Thanks to the panelists, and thanks to all the people who sent us the questions and participated. Thank you to the interpreters. And that were my closing remarks. Mark, if you want to say something more, or if somebody else would like to have another remark. Otherwise, we'll have a small break and come back with our next panel on transparency.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, David.
Thank you very much, Petros. See you at 4.
See you at 4.
Thanks, everyone, and good luck.
Bye. Thanks, Julie. Good luck with the petition. Hi.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Rie.
Hello, before we start again, I will do a small check. Is everything okay with the interpretation?
Καλησπέρα σας κύριε Κόκαλη.
Καλησπέρα, γεια σας. Τι κάνετε, Γιάννη?
Ευχαριστώ.
All right. I'll remind you that you have interpretation in a few languages. You will find the button down. Right there. If you don't see it, you probably need to update your Zoom. That's on the main screen. That's only for interpretation. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. We will follow. The floor is yours.
Can we start?
Yes, I think so, no? Maybe we can wait 1 more minute.
Yeah. Okay, so let's start, let's begin. And my name is Petros Kokalis. I am a member of the parliament with the left and a series of Progressive Alliance from Greece. And today I have the honor to open the fourth and last panel of the 2 days conference on vaccines as a public good organized by our political group by the left. And day two was all about EU's pharmaceutical and patent laws in the post-COVID-19 world, and a discussion about how to solve the issues of medicine and medical devices shortages and high prices of the medicine in the European Union. In this panel, we will be focusing on transparency and accountability on the European Union's advanced purchase agreements, the APA, the so-called APAs, on vaccine and their negotiation. We have the honor to have with us excellent speakers today, and they will each have about 20 minutes to make their speech, their presentation, and we'll shortly present them. First of all, we have Mr. Yannis Natsis, who's a policy advisor for the European Public Health Alliance and the board member of the European Medicine Agency. And thank you, Yannis, for being with us. Next will be Mr. Olivier Hudeman, Research and Campaign Coordinator for Corporate Europe Observatory, talking to us more about the procedures. And then Mr. Andreas Xanthos, member of the Greek Parliament and former Minister of Health of Greece. Thank you, Andreas, for joining us. And at this point, I would like to remind everybody that there is interpretation, and also like to thank the interpreters. You can see at the bottom right side of your screen, you can switch to English, French, German, Greek, or Czech. And also with us for the closing remarks, we have my colleague Marco Tenga, from member of the parliament from Belgium, who has done a lot and very good work in the past months, specifically on trying to push for greater transparency. Now, one of the issues of one of the factors of success of the great vaccination effort has been is the transparency that is required, and there's a lack of transparency in very great many cases. There has been a lack of transparency during the negotiation of the contracts on the advanced purchase agreements. There's been a lack of transparency in some data coming from national health system. And as we move, so we think that this discussion is very timely because it's critical as we move out of this pandemic, that we move towards a better place, that we move towards a place where we have learned the lessons of the past, and we do not repeat them, that we do not expect different results from doing the same things. And we will arrive, we hopefully will have the opportunity now to arrive to a world that is much safer for everybody, that's much more equal for everybody, and a world where we have realized that the road of privatization and extreme natural resource extraction can only lead us to this crisis of increasing frequency, this crisis of increasing severity, of less periodicity, with catastrophic results, not only for health, but also for economy and for democratic rights. So I will coordinate. I would like to welcome everybody who is attending. Thank you first for attending, and also welcome you to give us your questions at the Facebook chat, or here at the chat at the Zoom if you are attending in the Zoom. We will have the three first presentations for about 20 minutes, and then we will move on to discuss your questions or anybody else's questions that we have at this point. So I would like to close this short introduction and give the floor to Mr. Yannis Natsis, who, like I said, is a member of the board for European Medicine Agency and also a policy advisor at the European Public Health Alliance. Yannis, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation, and congratulations on fostering this dialogue. This is, as you said, a very timely event. And we are capable of talking about these contracts and these advanced purchase agreements only thanks to the struggle, and unfortunately it has been a struggle, to have transparent information available on what has been going on and happening during the months of negotiations between pharmaceutical companies and the European Union, namely the European Commission, but also the representatives of member states. It is important to remember that in these contracts, these deals, it really took two to tango. And I'm not only referring to the Commission and EU on one side and the pharmaceutical companies on the other, but also the member states were very much involved, of course, to varying degrees, but they were, and some of them were left in the dark, but we cannot only put the blame on Brussels. And I have very consciously chosen the title for my presentation, and I will share my screen. I hope it goes well, technically speaking. I have very consciously chosen this title, The Struggle for Transparency of COVID in Times of COVID-19, because it hasn't been easy to get our hands on information about these contracts, about the exchanges that resulted in these contracts. And I would say that it is only thanks to the European Parliament, pressure coming from civil society, and of course, questions raised by the international press, that now we have some information. So before I proceed, some disclosure in terms of the declaration of interest. IFA, the European Public Health Alliance, my organization, we received no funding from the industry. And I personally have no conflict of interest in relation to this presentation. I would also like to briefly explain that IFA, the European Public Health Alliance, we've been around for 28 years in Brussels. We are a non-profit advocating for better health across different areas. And I lead the work on pharmaceuticals, advocating for better and affordable medicines. So where are we today? And what do we now know thanks to transparency, thanks to the transparency that we now have around these contracts? In the eyes of the pharmaceutical companies, the EU has been an easy negotiator. The EU, we know that now with these signed deals, which some of them have now been published, released by the European Commission, and we have some redacted versions, we know that the European Union got some affordable or relatively and temporarily, if I may add, affordable prices, at least for this first round of contracts for these doses. But that does not mean that the EU has been a tough negotiator. On the contrary, it is clear, as we see in these weeks and these months, and I believe this will continue for quite some weeks and months to come, the pharmaceutical companies did overpromise, and they are under-delivering. Yet, we see that pharmaceutical companies are left off the hook. We see that there are high-profile events. So we saw last week the CEOs of the pharmaceutical companies coming to the parliament, but still, there's not so much you can do to force them to comply and to respect their commitments. This is why I'm saying that they are under-delivering and yet they're left off the hook. We see that there are no sanctions, no penalties, no possibility really to bring them to court for failing to comply. Reading these redacted contracts, which are now available thanks to the consistent and continuous work and push from the European Parliament, and I would like to congratulate your political group, but also some other political groups who were who really spearheaded this push for transparency. Thanks to these redacted contracts, we see that the commitments that the companies undertook were rather vague and abstract. And at the end of the day, thanks to the flexibilities, but also the guarantees very generously granted by the legislator, by the public, by the European Union, the companies really undertook a very limited, I would even dare to say, zero business risk for these vaccines. That is why my conclusion, reading these redacted contracts, is that the contracts are disproportionately favorable towards the companies. I would say, to put it simply, there is a lot of carrot in these contracts, but very little stick in exchange for promises. It is important to remember that most of these contracts were signed during the second half of last year. At the time, of course, we weren't even sure whether we would get to a successful vaccine. And that is something important to remember. And that's why we call them advance purchase agreements. So now that we see the problems with the limited supply, with the scarcity, with the companies failing to deliver what they promised, and they said that it would be fine by them and that they would be able to deliver, we see that the EU had at its disposal more leverage, and it chose not to use its leverage effectively, and it failed to force the pharmaceutical companies to proactively work together, collaborate. And collaborate in what exactly? Collaborate specifically when it comes to the scaling up of the manufacturing capacity. Everyone knew, I think all of us today in this virtual meeting, we all knew that the moment that we would get a successful vaccine, what would happen? Everyone would want the vaccine. Everyone would want to get it. So obviously there would be extreme demand and very limited supply. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this to reiterate that practically the problems that we now see in terms of the scaling up of the manufacturing capacity were all largely foreseen. They were all, those problems were predictable. This is why in the contracts, there should have been at least specific provisions forcing the respective companies to put aside, to reserve a specific percentage of their production for the EU. And that, as we see in the redacted contracts now available, there are no such provisions. And why am I saying that? Because we know that AstraZeneca and all of these companies, they have a lot of multiple clients that demand to be served, all of them simultaneously. And of course, one of the primary objectives of the EU vaccine strategy was to secure these doses. And today we see that those doses are far from secured. The doses, the national vaccination programs are unfortunately up in the air dependent on the doses that we're going to get or not get from the companies. Also, when it comes to the price, I said that one of the big successes of or one of the few successes of the EU vaccine strategy was the fact that we managed to get, at least for this first round of contracts, relatively good, affordable prices for Europe. We know also, thanks to on-the-record revelations and remarks made by the chief negotiators, namely Sandra Gallina of the European Commission, but also Clemens Auer, representing the member states of Austria. We now know that during these negotiations, pharmaceutical companies did try to profiteer. It doesn't come as a surprise to me. But for many, especially as you recall, last spring, there were a lot of pledges coming from pharma saying, we will not make any profit. And now we know, as I said, thanks to the comments made on the record by the chief negotiators, that companies did try to charge excessive prices for these vaccines, for these doses. But still, we don't know how the price was set. And why is it this price and not a higher price or even a lower price? That is another point which is missing from the contracts. Moreover, we know for a fact, and that was, I would say, one of the pillars of the EU vaccine strategy since day one, the down payments, the considerable public funds in terms of guarantees that the EU put forward in order to reserve these doses and to jump the queue, if you want. So pharma, based on the contracts, is not even expected to justify the investment. It is not even expected to explain how these vast amounts of public money has been used and where has it been used and to what extent and to what end. Overall, today we can say almost with certainty that these contracts were mere price volume agreements. These contracts were not at all in a sense of a meaningful partnership between the public and the private sector. Don't get me wrong, the private sector could have been part of the solution. I think now increasingly we see that it is part of the problem. At the end of the day, the vaccines that we have today are a result of the joint venture between the public and the private. And we shouldn't underestimate the multi-layered and multifaceted support, public support that went into this R&D process. Also, it is clear to me in these contracts that there is no public health approach. Unfortunately, public health is reduced to a commercial transaction in the sense of getting these doses. And this is why today we see that the national vaccination programs across the Union are up in the air. In the end, as I said, one of the top priorities for the European Union was to put this money down in order to get to jump the queue. Have we really accomplished that? And I'm not going to go into the moral discussion whether this was ethical or not as to the rest of the globe, of course, and that is a very important element. And I know that you touched upon this very important matter in the previous panels. Obviously, there the EU has been rather hypocritical. But even when it comes to the cynical, let's say, argument of really jumping the queue for Europeans, it is clear that we didn't even accomplish that, although we paid quite a lot of money for it. The doses, as I said, they are not truly secured, and all you have to do is look around you in any and every member state of the European Union and just read the news when it comes to the slow vaccine rollout. And I think it wouldn't be too much to say that in the end, the EU simply bought. The EU did not negotiate. And this is why today, where we are, being super dependent on the pharmaceutical companies, and still very keen on helping them, as we see with the endeavor of Commissioner Breton, of simply throwing more money at the industries, hoping they will be able to deliver. I would say that overall, thanks to COVID-19 or in light of the pandemic, the pharmaceutical companies have become a key political actor, a key political interlocutor. It is clear that they are no longer a simple business sector like any other. And the pharmaceutical companies, the moment that you have across the union, heads of state, prime ministers, picking up the phone and speaking directly to the CEOs of the companies, that shows that the companies currently have and enjoy disproportionate political clout and influence, although recent weeks have shown that they are unreliable. And I think that pharmaceutical companies, yes, on one hand, they are disproportionately influential as we speak, but at the same time, the ongoing disruption, supply disruption challenges that the European Union faces are indeed a big blow to the company's image. Of course, in all of this discussion, especially when it comes to the discussion around reshoring or strengthening Europe's autonomy and self-sufficiency, there is clearly a geopolitical and geostrategic dimension, which is, of course, valid, but at the same time used by the pharmaceutical companies as a lobbying strategy for them to gain more power, more access, more influence, and of course, more money. Of course, now we need to look also on the other side. This is a learning curve for the European Union. We need to be honest about it. There is a benefit, I would say, of the doubt. We know for a fact that countries negotiating solo would have been a disaster, especially for smaller and medium-sized EU member states. I think it is, as I said, we did get comparatively affordable prices, especially in light of the fact that pharma did try to profiteer and they did try to get excessive prices. Let's see what happens with the subsequent rounds of contracts. The EU invested in the R&I process, and I think it is important that for the first time, thanks to COVID-19, in light of the current pandemic, member states are encouraged to think in terms of R&D. In this case, it is clear that the public de-risked the R&D process. I would say the pharma in this situation was one of the safest businesses in the world because of the public guarantees and flexibilities. And on the bright side, I think it is an important milestone and a very important precedent that we have these, even if they are redacted contracts released. Of course, we need to see all of the contracts being published with a bare minimum of reductions. And transparency doesn't stop here. The European Commission and the EU and the member states need to show us the contracts, but also publish minutes and the exchanges between the European Commission and the pharmaceutical companies that brought us to these deals. We need to shed light into the months-long negotiations, but also shed light into the communication, the internal communication, the communication between the European Commission and the member states within the steering board. Secrecy, ladies and gentlemen, was convenient both for pharmaceutical companies and for the European Union. I remind you that last spring and last summer and last fall, when all of these contracts were signed, the #1 priority, not only in Brussels, but also in many European capitals, was to get this done as soon as possible with as few of questions as possible asked, or with no questions asked. And this is why the speedy conclusion of these contracts was the #1 priority. Of course, then the AstraZeneca fiasco happened, and the European Commission itself, the European Commission was against transparency, or was not really very keen, let me put it this way, more diplomatically, was not very keen on disclosing those deals. But then when the fiasco with AstraZeneca happened, then even the European Commission sought refuge in transparency, in publishing these contracts. That's why, as Petros Kokkalis said at the beginning, transparency, in our opinion, needs to be the starting point for any future negotiation. For months, especially you, members of the European Parliament, in the numerous hearings and exchanges you've had with the Commission, you kept hearing the Commission saying, oh, I'm sorry, we are sorry, we cannot show you the contracts because of these confidentiality clauses. Our hands are tied, we cannot disclose this information. I think from now on, and for the ongoing and for the continuous and the future rounds of negotiation of joint procurement, and that is another interesting discussion, the prospects for joint procurement at the EU level. I think the EU is a very powerful market. There is no doubt that the pharmaceutical companies need us as much as we need them. And therefore, the European Union needs to use its leverage and make it clear, crystal clear to the companies that for any future negotiations, the contracts will be published. Transparency on the European level is possible, is feasible, is desirable, and it works in different ways than, for instance, let's say, a small member state negotiating a contract with a pharmaceutical giant. So where there is a will, there is a way. And just to conclude by saying that from the pharmaceutical companies' perspective, they are very happy with the APAs. They were very happy with how these negotiations went. As I said, if I were a pharmaceutical company, I would have signed these contracts very comfortably and very easily without any hesitation. The pharmaceutical companies want to maintain this legacy. They want to consolidate this public-private partnership approach, which in practice, in their eyes, means sharing the risks, but not the rewards. And obviously, that's something that we need to steer away from. Brussels itself, I would say, wants to have a say, wants to have a role in medicines procurement. It's unclear to me at this stage whether member states, of course, it varies amongst the 27 membership. It's unclear whether member states would go along with it. Yet there is a role for the European Commission to play to facilitate the cross-country collaborations. And we have amongst us today Andreas Xanthos, the former Minister of Health from Greece, who played, he was one of the protagonists in launching the Valletta Declaration, the regional intergovernmental initiative of collaboration, following in the footsteps of the Beneluxa initiative. Therefore, the excessive medicines prices, the problem is a systemic problem, which is not going to go away. Affordability, even in the mandate of Stella Kyriakidis, is named, the affordability of medicines is named as the #1 priority for the commissioner. But at the same time, it is clear that in light of the pandemic, the regular exchanges, the continuous exchanges, which are understandable between pharmaceutical companies and all different layers of power and decision-making, these exchanges create a fertile ground for lobbying in the future, for favorable, let me put it this way, pro-business pieces of regulation and legislation to come. And we need to be very careful, ladies and gentlemen. We need to be very careful because what I see now, especially with the whole discussion around the vaccines and the scaling up of the manufacturing capacity, the bringing back the companies and the production to Europe, I see a conflation, a dangerous mixing up of industrial policy with public health policy. And the two are distinct and need to remain distinct. Thank you so very much. I'm at your disposal for any further questions. And thank you very much once again for the invitation.
Thank you, Yanis, for this presentation and bringing us deeper into the world of the contracts between the European Union and the big and the pharmaceutical companies. I think that the point of transparency going forward in the upcoming contracts is a very important starting point for us to not repeat the same mistakes as happened in the past. And you mentioned that the lobbying strategy of the pharmaceutical companies trying to secure these profits and these monopolies. So I would now give the floor to Mr. Olivier Hudeman, whose organization, Corporate Europe Observatory, is precisely observing the lobbying efforts. And they have come up also with a very interesting report on when the market becomes deadly, focusing on the cost of the privatization of the public health sector, the minimization of the public health sector. And I would invite him to tell us a little bit about that as well, especially since Minister Xanthos yesterday was central in the presentation of the new progressive public health policy proposal by Syriza and our President Alexis Tsipras. So moving health back towards the public domain. And Mr. Hudeman, the floor is yours.
Yes, thanks so much. Well, to start with, I fully agree with what Yannis has stated about the importance of transparency in the ongoing vaccine negotiations and in any future negotiations between the EU and Big Pharma. And I would like to use the next 15 minutes just to go a bit deeper into why transparency is so crucial, not just as a starting point for democratic scrutiny of those in power, not just for building public trust, which is so important in the context of a pandemic and for the development of and rollout of the vaccines to get out of the pandemic, but also because transparency, I would argue, could really have helped create a totally different outcome. It could have helped prevent the current crisis of vaccine scarcity that we're in today, where we are now scrambling to find a solution, and that solution could have been a central part of the approach 6 months ago or earlier. So Yannis already provided a really excellent overview of all the things that have gone wrong in the EU's vaccines negotiations. The fact that the EU simply concentrated on buying vaccines and they failed to negotiate strong public interest conditions. Others have described the negotiating approach as a softball approach. That means that we're now left with relying on the goodwill of the pharma companies. And the outcome could have been very different. Yannis already alluded to it. Actually, the EU had a very strong negotiating position from the beginning. They were negotiating jointly on behalf of 27 countries, which was an excellent starting point. They had a massive budget for funding research and development and preparing of the manufacturing of the vaccines. And it all happened in the context of a pandemic in which the pharmaceutical companies had repeatedly pledged to put global health ahead of their own profits. They've made a lot of statements of that kind. So all of that combined was a fantastic starting point, a very strong negotiating position. But the negotiators clearly failed to use that starting point that they had. And I would say that the secrecy around the negotiations is another dimension of that. Proactive transparency, far-reaching transparency around the talks would have further helped strengthen the EU's hand in the negotiations. It could have become a tool to get a much better deal out of these talks with Big Pharma. The Commission instead chose for exactly the opposite approach, which was one of secrecy around the talks, until the moment, indeed, in January, when the public pressure had become unbearable, and they decided to release a redacted version of the AstraZeneca contract. So the Commission's approach has been one, unfortunately, of secrecy for a very long time for the crucial part of the negotiations. And I would like to just go a bit deeper into that based on the battle that my organization has had around freedom of information to the contracts, access to the contracts, and to key documents around the negotiations. So that's a battle that started in September, where we decided to submit several freedom of information requests. We had at that moment just published a new report with the title "Power and Profits During a Pandemic: Why the Pharmaceutical Industry Needs More Scrutiny, Not Less." And that report basically analyzed the first six months of the pandemic and the influence of the pharmaceutical industry's lobbying in that period. So we all have known for a while that the pharma lobby spends millions of euros on lobbying in Brussels every year, and that they enjoy very far-reaching privileged access to decision-making. So we thought it was really important to find out what Big Pharma had been using that lobbying power for during the pandemic. And what we found was that there was a massive gap between these public declarations by the pharmaceutical multinationals, in which they claimed to be committed to do whatever it takes, whatever they could, to help get out of the pandemic as soon as possible. And then on the other hand, their actual lobbying demands in the meetings with the European Commission and with member state governments behind closed doors. And those lobbying demands were extremely self-serving. They were mainly about preventing any form of departure from the current model of medicines policy making on the EU level, which is a combination of generous public funding and these very far-reaching monopoly patent protection systems. That model is so extremely profitable for these companies, and their lobbying in practice was all about keeping those privileges in place. So based on what we had discovered about the actual lobbying agenda of Big Pharma during the pandemic, we realized that it was really crucial to secure transparency around what happened in these vaccine negotiations and the contracts agreed with Big Pharma, what Big Pharma was lobbying for, how they were using that power in those crucial talks. And that's why we submitted these two Freedom of Information requests. We were actually quite optimistic in the beginning because the EU's Freedom of Information law is quite strong on paper. But in practice, the Commission's handling of our requests has systematically violated the legal requirements in the EU's Freedom of Information law. That's been the experience. I have myself done these kind of requests, FOI requests, for more than 20 years, trying to get information disclosed by the European Commission. And I don't think I've experienced anything as bad as this in all of those years. So the first of the requests was about the vaccine deal contracts themselves. And at least for that one, we did get a response. So after 6 weeks, I think, we got a letter from the Commission refusing us access to the first of the contracts that was signed, the AstraZeneca contract. But nothing in those contracts could be published, according to the Commission, not a word, not even a redacted version. And their argument was it could not be disclosed because it had to protect AstraZeneca's commercial interests. And they claimed at that time that there was no overriding public interest in transparency. We, of course, strongly disagreed with that, so we appealed the decision. And what happened then was that the Commission just failed to respond for several months, violating the legal deadlines again. The second of the requests was about the notes of meetings and the correspondence with pharmaceutical companies in the negotiations. And for that request, the Commission actually never responded. In 4 months' time, we never got a response, only one extension of the deadline after the other, until the Commission in the end postponed it indefinitely. So it was for us impossible to escape the impression that the Commission was playing a game of delay tactics, using a lot of different tricks, you could say, to avoid having to disclose any document whatsoever about the negotiations. So that was the moment that we decided to go to the European Ombudsman and submit a complaint against the European Commission. The Ombudsman opened an inquiry and gave the Commission 3 weeks to respond. Quite incredibly, the Commission missed that deadline. They failed to respond in time. Eventually, a response came, and I can present to you what was in that response, because it has both some positive news and some very fundamental problems. So in the letter, the Commission acknowledged that there is a strong need for transparency around the vaccine negotiations. It also states that it's committed to ensure as much transparency as possible. So that's good. Of course, in line with the Commission's statements ever since the AstraZeneca debacle in January. The Commission also announced in that letter that it hopes to publish all the remaining contracts very soon, and that Commission will receive a list of 320 documents that it has identified that are about notes from meetings with Big Pharma and correspondence. So 320 documents. And the Commission announces that when it has decided if they can be disclosed, they will be made available online on a Commission website. So those are some welcome bits of news, and so far so good, you could say. What is completely missing from the Commission's response is any indication of when this will happen. There is no mention of a deadline, no mention of any timeline. And consider that we have already waited for 6 months, and that the content of these documents is really of crucial importance for answering questions that people have across Europe, and questions that are the focus of heated public debates and political debates in Europe right now. A further delay would really be unacceptable. Now, what is also worth mentioning is that the Commission in its letter mentions that the assessment of whether these 320 documents can be disclosed is still ongoing, and that it involves the consultation with third parties. Now, these third parties are the pharmaceutical companies with which the Commission has negotiated. And that makes me wonder whether these consultations are the real cause of the delay. Also, it makes me wonder exactly what kind of influence the pharmaceutical companies have been given over the question whether these documents can be disclosed or not. So those are some questions that we have raised with the Commission in our response that we sent to the Ombudsman in the beginning of this week. We of course hope that the Ombudsman's continued inquiry will put strong pressure on the Commission to move fast and make these documents public. And just to reiterate, it really makes a huge difference if those documents will be released in the coming weeks, or if we have to wait another 6 months. And that's basically the difference between enabling a public debate and public scrutiny at a time when we can still learn some important lessons and act on them for the next steps in vaccines procurement and the questions about vaccines manufacturing. Or if the documents will only come at a time when that's too late, and it's basically something for the history books. So in terms of transparency, you could say that the Commission is now very much talking the talk, but not yet walking the walk. And the coming weeks will show if that is something that will change or not. So the Ombudsman's inquiry, looking into not only the transparency around the contracts, but also the disclosure of these 320 key documents. When those documents are released, they will finally show how the EU negotiators handled the negotiations. And it will allow us to answer the key questions, such as, did they actually negotiate to make vaccines a universal public good, as promised by von der Leyen? And how did they try to secure public interest conditions in the contracts? And what went wrong in that? The details of that will be in those documents. So these are, of course, crucial questions that European citizens really deserve an answer to right now, and not in 6 months and not in 12 months. So let me finish just by summing up why transparency around the vaccine negotiations, as demanded by MEPs and by civil society from the very beginning, could really have helped prevent this current crisis of vaccine scarcity that we're in. As mentioned, transparency is not just a democratic right, it's not just essential for building public trust. It's something that really could have secured a better outcome than what we're left with today. To start with, transparency around the negotiations, it would have enabled properly informed public debates and parliamentary scrutiny. It would have been a tool to secure accountability in those negotiations. The weaknesses that we now are aware of in the EU's negotiating approach, they would have become evident almost 6 months ago, before it was too late to actually correct them. For instance, the fact that the EU very recklessly relied on a small number of pharmaceutical companies to develop the needed manufacturing capacity. That mistake could have been spotted early on, and a better approach could have been initiated in the autumn if there had been transparency. Transparency would have strengthened the hand of the EU negotiators vis-à-vis Big Pharma. I mentioned that in the beginning, because I think public opinion would almost surely have supported attempts by the negotiators to force pharmaceutical companies to agree on making the vaccines a public good. in return, of course, to the generous public funding that they received. So all of this, of course, assumes that making the vaccines a global public good, von der Leyen's promise, that it was actually a key goal in the negotiations and not just an empty promise. And for me, that's perhaps the question that I'm most eager to get an answer to when these documents are finally released. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Olivier. Thank you for your presentation, and thank you for all the work you've been doing in the past months and all these years, of course, in the interest of transparency. I think Mark Bodenga would agree with me that maybe we can do as much as we can to support and put some pressure on the Ombudsman inquiry. Really, your presentation of the Commission stonewalling transparency and and flouting freedom of information law is shocking at this point. And one of the critical issues going forward and moving out of this pandemic would be that transparency is not a collateral damage, is not a victim to the pandemic and the pandemic state, as we have seen with other democratic functions and democratic rights and freedom of movement and so on and so forth. So I would like to give the floor to Mr. Andreas Xanthos to talk to us a little bit more about the importance of public health and the role of transparency in a public health system. Andrea.
Να σας καλησπερίσω και να σας ευχαριστήσω για την πρόσκληση. Πραγματικά χαίρομαι που είμαι ξανά με αγαπητούς φίλους και συντρόφους για μια συζήτηση πολύ επίκαιρη, νομίζω, η οποία διατηρεί το ενδιαφέρον της κοινής γνώμης, διότι όλοι καταλαβαίνουμε ότι είμαστε σε μια κρίσιμη καμπή αυτής της μεγάλης διασυνοριακής απειλής, της μεγάλης υγειονομικής κρίσης της παγκόσμιας. Είμαστε σε μια κρίσιμη καμπή, ιδιαίτερα μετά την πολύ κέρια εξέλιξη που ήταν η ανακάλυψη των εμβολίων. Και ενώ υπήρξε πολύ μεγάλη προσδοκία ότι αυτή η ανακάλυψη, η οποία, όπως υπόθηκε ήδη, χρηματοδοτήθηκε σε μεγάλο βαθμό με δημόσιους πόρους, ότι αυτή η ανακάλυψη θα άλλαζε ριζικά τη ροή των πραγμάτων και θα είχαμε ένα εξαιρετικό εργαλείο το οποίο θα μπορούσε με ισότιμο και καθολικό τρόπο να συμβάλλει στην ανοσοποίηση του πληθυσμού και στην αναχέτηση αυτής της πανδημίας. Βλέπουμε ότι έχουν γεννηθεί νέα προβλήματα, νέου τύπου ανισότητες, νέου τύπου ανταγωνισμοί και δυστυχώς η προτροπή του Παγκόσμιου Οργανισμού Υγείας να αποφύγουμε τον εθνικισμό των εμβολίων, αυτή η προτροπή δεν ευωδόθηκε, δεν βρήκε πρόσφορο έδαφος. Βλέπουμε αυτή την περίοδο ιδιαίτερα, αλλά μέσα και στην Ευρώπη, αλλά και σε όλο τον κόσμο, να εντείνονται οι εταιρικοί ανταγωνισμοί, οι ανταγωνισμοί ανάμεσα σε χώρες, οι ανταγωνισμοί για την πολιτική επιρροή και βεβαίως η εθνικιστική αναδίπλωση και η τάση πάρα πολλών χωρών να επιδιώκουν να είναι προτεραιότητα η κάλυψη των αναγκών του δικού τους πληθυσμού, αγνοώντας για την παγκόσμια ανάγκη γρήγορης δημιουργίας συλλογικής ανοσίας, που είναι και η μόνη αποτελεσματική απάντηση σε μια κρίση δημόσιας υγείας. Σήμερα, λοιπόν, όπως έχει πει ο ΠΟΗ, είμαστε πλέον όχι στα πρόθυρα, υπάρχει μια ηθική αποτυχία στο παγκόσμιο σύστημα, στο να διασφαλίσει την ισότιμη και έγκαιρη πρόσβαση στο πολύ σημαντικό αυτό, σε αυτή τη σημαντική επιστημονική εξέλιξη, στο μόνο ουσιαστικά εργαλείο πρωτογενούς πρόληψης μιας πανδημίας που είναι το εμβόλιο. 130 χώρες δεν έχουν καθόλου εμβόλια και αυτή η πολύ φιλόδοξη πρωτοβουλία COVAX του Παγκόσμιου Οργανισμού Υγείας, η οποία στα χαρτιά και στη θεωρία τη στηρίζουν οι πάντες, που μόνο πριν λίγες μέρες κατάφερε να δώσει τα πρώτα εμβόλια σε μία χώρα, στην Γκάνα. Άρα λοιπόν είμαστε σε ένα διέξοδο. Η Ευρώπη έχει εμβολιάσει μόνο το 7,5% μετά από 2,5 μήνες κυκλοφορίας των εμβολίων στην αγορά, έχει εμβολιάσει μόνο το 2,5% του πληθυσμού της με μία δόση. Είναι πολύ μικρότερο το ποσοστό το οποίο έχει κάνει και τις 2 δόσεις και άρα έχει μια ικανοποιητική ανοσοποίηση. Υπάρχουν βεβαίως και οι εξαιρέσεις, το Ηνωμένο Βασίλειο που έχει πάνω από το 30% και άλλες χώρες στον κόσμο, το Ισραήλ και άλλες χώρες στον κόσμο που τα έχουν πάει λίγο καλύτερα σε αυτό το πεδίο. Αλλά η ουσία είναι ότι πρέπει, ότι αυτό νομίζω το αδιέξοδο αυτό πρέπει να αναζητήσουμε έναν τρόπο να το υπερβούμε. Και θεωρώ ότι είναι κομβικής σημασίας, πέρα από τα ζητήματα της διαφάνειας, τα οποία θέσατε και ο Γιάννης και ο Ολιβιέ προηγουμένως, νομίζω με πολύ εξαιρετικό τρόπο. Όντως δεν είναι κρίσιμη προϋπόθεση και για τη διαπραγμάτευση και τη διασφάλιση συμφωνιών με βάση το δημόσιο και το κοινωνικό συμφέρον, είναι η διαφάνεια, αλλά είναι και, όπως πολύ σωστά επισήμανε ο Ολιβιέ, είναι και ένας κρίσιμος όρος για να χτιστεί εμπιστοσύνη των πολιτών, των Ευρωπαίων πολιτών, απέναντι στους θεσμούς της Ευρώπης, απέναντι στα όργανα της και να μην ενισχύεται ο ευρωσκεπτικισμός και η αμφισβήτηση και να μην απονομιμοποιούνται αυτοί οι θεσμοί. Πέρα όμως από τη διαφάνεια, το θέμα είναι ότι προφανώς δεν υπήρχε η πολιτική βούληση να γίνει στην πράξη το εμβόλιο παγκόσμιο δημόσιο αγαθό. Διότι για να γίνει αυτό έπρεπε να αμφισβητηθεί, όπως επισημάνατε και οι δύο, το σημερινό μοντέλο διεθνούς οργάνωσης της φαρμακευτικής αγοράς. Αυτό είναι το κρίσιμο στοιχείο. Και το θέμα είναι ότι χωρίς όμως αμφισβήτηση αυτού του μοντέλου, που ως πυρήνα του έχει την προστασία των δικαιωμάτων, των πνευματικών δικαιωμάτων και των διπλωμάτων ευρεσιτεχνίας, χωρίς να αμφισβητηθεί αυτό το μοντέλο, δεν μπορεί να υπάρξει μια ριζική απάντηση στη σημερινή δυσκολία. Νομίζω ότι αυτό είναι κέρια σημασίας. Η μόνη λοιπόν απάντηση για να υπερβούμε τον εθνικισμό των εμβολίων, για να υπερβούμε τους ανταγωνισμούς, για να κάνουμε το παγκόσμιο πλαίσιο να είναι συνεργατικό και όχι ανταγωνιστικό, είναι να αμφισβητηθεί αυτό το κατοχυρωμένο για δεκαετίες δικαίωμα των φαρμακευτικών εταιριών. Απέναντι σε αυτό το δικαίωμα υπάρχει το βαθύτατο δικαίωμα των ανθρώπων όλου του κόσμου σε γρήγορη και ισότιμη ανοσοποίηση. Αυτό είναι το κρίσιμο δίλημμα και νομίζω σε αυτό το κρίσιμο δίλημμα αποφεύγει να πάρει θέση και η Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση, αλλά και οι επιμέρους εθνικές κυβερνήσεις. Και αυτό δημιουργεί πολλαπλά προβλήματα. Στη χώρα μας, δεν ξέρω αν ισχύει και σε άλλες χώρες της Ευρώπης, έχουμε θέματα διαφάνειας και στη διαχείριση αυτού του σπάνιου πόρου πια που είναι το εμβόλιο, το οποίο έρχεται με καθυστέρηση και υπάρχει μια αναγκαστική προτεραιοποίηση των ομάδων του πληθυσμού που πρέπει να εμβολιαστούν. Έχουμε λοιπόν αναπτυχθεί στην Ελλάδα, αξιοποιώντας το μηχανισμό των περισεβούμενων δόσεων στο τέλος της ημέρας στα εμβολιαστικά κέντρα, έχει αναπτυχθεί ένα δίκτυο εξυπηρέτησης, πελατειακής εξυπηρέτησης ημετέρων της κυβέρνησης. Είναι εντυπωσιακό αυτό, είναι ένα στοιχείο πραγματικά το οποίο προκαλεί τη κοινή γνώμη. Έχουν γίνει δηλαδή και οι εμβολιασμοί, η διαδικασία η εμβολιαστική έχει γίνει πεδίο αδιαφανούς διαχείρισης και εύνοιας συγκεκριμένων ανθρώπων οι οποίοι παρακάμπτουν την σειρά που έχει καθορίσει με επιστημονικά κριτήρια η Εθνική Επιτροπή Εμβολιασμών. Άρα λοιπόν, κατά την άποψή μου, το θέμα της ανεπάρκειας των εμβολίων δεν είναι τεχνικό, δεν είναι διαχειριστικής φύσεως, κατά την άποψή μου είναι πολύ πολιτικό, είναι αμιγώς πολιτικό και κυρίως έγκυται στην τεράστια επιρροή πολιτική και οικονομική της φαρμακοβιομηχανίας και της απροθυμίας των θεσμών της Ευρώπης να αμφισβητήσουν αυτή την επιρροή. Νομίζω ότι εκεί πρέπει να κατατείνουν οι προσπάθειες και οι πρωτοβουλίες και των πολιτικών δυνάμεων, των προοδευτικών, της αριστεράς, του ευρύτερου προοδευτικού τόξου, της κοινωνίας των πολιτών, των συμμαχιών των ασθενών, των φορέων, των οργανώσεων των υγειονομικών. Νομίζω ότι πρέπει πραγματικά να τεθεί ως κρίσιμη προτεραιότητα αυτό, διότι αλλιώς η διαδικασία θα είναι αργή, θα είναι προβληματική, θα καθυστερεί η ιστορία του χτισήματος του ανοσιακού φραγμού και θα είμαστε στο φαύλο κύκλο των εξάρσεων, των αναζωπυρώσεων, της αύξησης των κρουσμάτων και των παρατάσεων στα lockdowns, τα οποία εφαρμόζονται σε όλες τις χώρες της Ευρώπης. Και όπως πολύ σωστά επισήμανε ο Γιάννης ο Νάτσης, εδώ υπάρχει και το συστημικό πρόβλημα του πώς αντιμετωπίζουν τα κράτη, οι υπερεθνικοί θεσμοί, το ζήτημα της τιμολόγησης των νέων φαρμάκων. Άρα το αίτημα των δίκαιων τιμών είναι ένα αίτημα που τώρα πια ήρθε η πανδημία να δικαιώσει πραγματικά, με μια ιστορική καθυστέρηση λίγων χρόνων, να δικαιώσει πρωτοβουλίες που είχαν θέσει εδώ και καιρό στο επίκεντρο αυτής της συζήτησης την ανάγκη να υπάρξουν συνεργασίες περιφερειακές, κεντρικές, σε επίπεδο Ευρώπης, να αλλάξει διεθνώς το πλαίσιο που αφορά την κοστολόγηση της έρευνας και της ανάπτυξης των νέων φαρμάκων και εμβολίων, να υπάρχει διαφάνεια στο μηχανισμό τιμολόγησης, να μπορούν πραγματικά να διασφαλιστούν μέσα από πολυμερείς διαπραγματεύσεις δίκαιες τιμές, προσβάσιμες σε όλες τις χώρες και σε όλες τις κοινωνίες. Αυτό είναι ένα κρίσιμο, νομίζω, πεδίο. Το αίτημα αυτό έχει μια πολύ ισχυρή πλέον και επιστημονική και από την άποψη της δημόσιας υγείας, αλλά και κοινωνική και ηθική βάση, και νομίζω ότι πρέπει να γίνει μια πολιτική αιχμή στην επόμενη περίοδο για να υπερβούμε αυτές τις δυσκολίες και να πιέσουμε την Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση σε πρώτο επίπεδο να κάνει το κρίσιμο και αποφασιστικό βήμα. Συμφωνώ απολύτως ότι ήταν σημαντική η πρωτοβουλία της διαπραγμάτευσης με τις εταιρείες και της προαγοράς δόσεων. Αυτό άλλαξε τη ροή των πραγμάτων. Για πρώτη φορά συνέβη αυτό στην Ευρώπη. Συνειδητοποιήθηκε ο κίνδυνος, ο συστημικός κίνδυνος, να καταρρεύσει στην ουσία η Ευρώπη πλήρως μπροστά στην αδυναμία της να έχει μία ουσιαστική παρέμβαση σε αυτή τη μεγάλη υγειονομική κρίση. Νομίζω ότι θα ενισχυόταν πάρα πολύ πραγματικά οι αποσχιστικές τάσεις και το Brexit θα γινόταν πιθανότατα ένα ντόμινο το οποίο θα επηρέαζε όλες τις χώρες. Έκανε το πρώτο βήμα, αλλά δυστυχώς από ό,τι φαίνεται το έκανε με μισή καρδιά. Ακριβώς επειδή δεν ήθελε, δεν έχει την ισχυρή πολιτική βούληση να αμφισβητήσει αυτό το πλαίσιο. Τώρα είναι η ώρα να συμβάλλουμε όλοι με ψηφίσματα, με πρωτοβουλίες, με διαμαρτυρίες, με πολιτικές συμμαχίες μέσα στο Ευρωκοινοβούλιο, έτσι ώστε πραγματικά να ολοκληρωθεί αυτό το βήμα και να τεθεί το θέμα σε άλλη βάση, γιατί πρέπει να έχουμε στο μυαλό μας ότι η υπόθεση των εμβολίων θα έχει βάθος χρόνου. Οι νέες μεταλλάξεις πολύ πιθανότατα θα αναγκάσουν τις εταιρείες σε αναπροσαρμογές και σε τροποποίηση των υπαρχόντων εμβολίων. Άρα θα είναι μια υπόθεση με την οποία θα τη διαχειριζόμαστε για τα επόμενα χρόνια συστηματικά. Εάν λοιπόν δεν λύσουμε δομικά το πρόβλημα της αυξημένης παραγωγικής δυνατότητας σε όλο τον κόσμο για να γίνει στην πράξη αυτό το σημαντικό βήμα, το επιστημονικό, να γίνει παγκόσμιο δημόσιο αγαθό, νομίζω ότι πραγματικά θα είμαστε πολύ κατώτεροι των περιστάσεων. Αυτό είναι για μένα το κρίσιμο θέμα. Η διαφάνεια ούτως ή άλλως, για να απαντήσω και στην ερώτηση του Πέτρου του Κόκαλη, η διαφάνεια είναι όρος συνενέσεων, κοινωνικών και πολιτικών συνενέσεων. Και οι συνενέσεις, οι κοινωνικές και οι πολιτικές, είναι όρος για να διαχειριστεί κανείς με αποτελεσματικό τρόπο μια κρίση δημόσιας υγείας. Οι κρίσεις δημόσιας υγείας στην ιστορία αντιμετωπίστηκαν όταν οι πολίτες πίστηκαν και για την εκτίμηση του κινδύνου και για την ορθότητα των μέτρων των περιοριστικών μέτρων τα οποία εφαρμοζόταν. Όσο αυτό δεν συμβαίνει, όσο δεν υπάρχει διαφάνεια στην πρόσβαση στα επιδημιολογικά δεδομένα, όσο υπάρχουν στεγανά στην πληροφορία, όσο υπάρχουν στεγανά στη διαχείριση και έλλειψη συντονισμού ανάμεσα στους διάφορους κρίσιμους κρίκους του συστήματος επιδημιολογικής επιτήρησης, όσο τα κράτη στη διαχείρισή τους δείχνουν μια κρυψίνια και μια απροθυμία να μοιραστούν πληροφορίες, να εξηγήσουν και να πείσουν και προτιμούν την πολιτική του αποφασίζομαι και διατάσσομεν και πολλές φορές κάνουν και το κέριο λάθος να αναθέσουν ρόλους προστασίας της δημόσιας υγείας στην αστυνομία και στους μηχανισμούς καταστολής, τόσο νομίζω ότι απονομιμοποιούνται η διαχείριση που γίνεται, συσσωρεύονται κοινωνικές αντιστάσεις και διαμαρτυρίες, προκαλείται μία αμφισβήτηση και της αναγκαιότητας και της ορθότητας και της κατεύθυνσης των μέτρων. Αυτό νομίζω ότι είναι κρίσιμος όρος, γι' αυτό θεωρώ ότι όντως η διαφάνεια είναι ένα κομβικό στοιχείο το οποίο ανέδειξε αυτή η μεγάλη κρίση. Το άλλο κομβικό στοιχείο είναι η ανισότητα. Είναι οι πολλαπλές ανισότητες, οι υγειονομικές, οικονομικές και κοινωνικές, και ακριβώς γι' αυτό το λόγο θεωρώ ότι δημιουργεί, παρά τις τρομερές δυσκολίες, παρά την αλλαγή που έχει προκαλέσει στη ζωή όλων μας, στην πολιτική λειτουργία, στη λειτουργία της πολιτικής αυτή η ιστορία της πανδημίας, παρόλα αυτά θεωρώ ότι για την αριστερά ειδικά είναι ένα ευνοϊκό πεδίο παρέμβασης, επειδή ακριβώς η αριστερά είναι μια πολιτική δύναμη που έχει στον πυρήνα τον αξιακό, τον προγραμματικό της, την άρση των ανισοτήτων. Σας ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ.
Εμείς ευχαριστούμε, Ανδρέα. Thank you very much, Andreas, for this inspiring talk, explaining enforcing the realization of the pandemic that the market mechanisms have reached their limits, and that this is going to be a long fight ahead. This is one battle that's like described as the first step. There's going to be a long political struggle ahead to make sure that we do not arrive in the same place where we started. I would like to take the questions and to anybody who would like to answer them, and then give the floor to Mark Bodenga, my colleague, who has done the amazing work supporting the European Citizens Initiative Right to Cure and No Profit for Pandemic, which is pushing for the realization of for the liberation, let's say, of intellectual property rights. We have one question in the Q&A, and I have one question myself. So the question is, what are the lessons learned from vaccines procurement? Is there any chance that the EU will start buying medicines as a single entity in the near future? So this is something that Yannis can tell us. And I have another question for anybody who wants to take it, because the issue of transparency is multi-layered. It's not only on the vaccines contract, where Olivier has exposed the extreme secrecy under which it was conducted. And we have seen that we are still using the vocabulary and the arsenal of the market to address something which is clearly larger than the market. Andreas exposed the lack of transparency even in the vaccination process, in the disposal of, or not the disposal, the use of then not used vaccines for clientele purposes. And also, my question is about the transparency in the Council. We have the position apparently of the Council to oppose the waiver of the TRIPS waiver at the World Trade Organization, the waiver for the intellectual property rights, which is demanded by over 100 countries. So the question would be, what is the transparency there? Why is the European Union taking this position? What are each country's position on this? And how do we arrive at this decision? So before we give it over to Mark Bodenga, let's make another round with final comments. I will start with, as we started before, with Yanis.
Yes, thank you. It's a very good question. There is this discussion picking up in Brussels now. Is there a role for the EU to start buying jointly medicines? There was already a precedent with remdesivir, this treatment against COVID-19, but that again created a lot of noise because in the end, the WHO said that this drug doesn't really bring any true therapeutic benefit. Nevertheless, the European Commission went ahead and signed a contract again in confidentiality with Gilead, the manufacturing company. So in the near future, in the midterm, in the mid-run, I think there is more a way for the regional intergovernmental initiatives like the Benelux or the Valletta Group. I think those initiatives will be reactivated once the pandemic is more under control, I would say. There, I think it's an irreversible political choice for countries to work together. I remind you that the initiative of Benelux was born in the rich north, with some of the richest countries in the world, certainly some of the wealthiest EU member states, for the very simple reason that nobody, from Cyprus all the way to Denmark, nobody can cope with these excessive prices. And these initiatives are a step. I mean, member states are trying to organize themselves. They're trying to organize themselves in the way that companies organize themselves, like a corporate board, I would say. So they're trying to organize themselves to address and mitigate the negative consequences for them of the power imbalance and the information asymmetry. Companies, as we know, they traditionally favor the divide and conquer practice. We have in our company today a minister of health from a country whom I'm sure who has for sure experienced what it means negotiating with these pharmaceutical giants, who now, in light of COVID-19, have become titans, bigger than giants. Therefore, these initiatives of collaboration are the way forward. Now, Brussels needs to do more to gain the trust of member states. And I think the experience from the vaccines procurement creates definitely some food for thought. But I don't think that at this stage, member states are willing to grant the European Commission more power over this very sensitive area of policymaking. But of course, in the larger picture and further down the road, the market, be it via Valletta or Beluxa, it's still a market segmentation. And I think market segmentation doesn't help us, doesn't help the public. Therefore, maybe in the future, more in the distant future, we would have to move towards joint pushes for procurement on the EU level. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we all 27 need to move together at all times. It doesn't mean either that all medicines would be candidates for such an initiative. Perhaps we should zoom in the most expensive drugs. It really varies, so it's not a one-size-fits-all. Just to conclude, my answer would be in the near and mid-run, I would say more like Beneluxa, but also even Beneluxa itself and the Valletta Group will evolve. They're very promising, but they're still at the very early stages. And I don't think, and countries like Greece need to provide the political support and the political backing for these initiatives. Otherwise, they're left alone in the face of companies, and the only guiding principle for these companies is to make profit. They're not charities. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Yanni. Olivier?
Yes, I would like to comment on your question about council transparency. I think you're raising an extremely important point. Indeed, the situation now with the EU continuing to refuse to agree to the TRIPS waiver, continuing to refuse southern governments the right to use this waiver to secure access to these life-saving vaccines and treatments for COVID-19 is a completely immoral position to take. And the fact that we cannot see that there's not sufficient transparency to know what the position of the 27 different EU governments is a major problem. It's a huge obstacle to holding these governments accountable. So this is one of the main problems with the democratic deficit in the EU, I would argue, is the secrecy in council. It is still something like a black box that enables governments to blame Brussels, to blame decisions made in these untransparent forums behind closed doors in council for unpopular decisions that they themselves maybe have been very deeply implicated in making. So for democratic accountability, we really need to have very urgently more transparency in council decision making, more democratic accountability there. And just to add that this black box that the council is at the moment is also the perfect space for industry lobbyists to have excessive influence, including the pharmaceutical industry. I have little doubt that they are using the situation that is there now for their own agenda.
Thank you, Olivier. Of course, also this raises the issue of transparency of data and the issue of vaccine passports and how is this data going to be used. Andrea, δύο τελευταίες λέξεις.
Ευχαριστώ, Πέτρο. Νομίζω ότι η επισήμανση του Γιάννη του Νάτση για την ανάγκη να ενεργοποιηθούν οι προϋπάρχουσες πρωτοβουλίες διακρατικής συνεργασίας και κοινής διαπραγμάτευσης απέναντι στις φαρμακευτικές, όπως είναι η Μπενελούξα στο βορρά και η Βαλέτα στο νότο, είναι πραγματικά τώρα χρυσή ευκαιρία. Μόνο που αυτό προϋποθέτει ισχυρή πολιτική βούληση, η οποία δυστυχώς στην Ελλάδα, με τη συντηρητική κυβέρνηση σήμερα που έχουμε, δεν υπάρχει. Τους το έχουμε πει εδώ και πάρα πολύ καιρό. Θυμίζω ότι αυτή η πρωτοβουλία ξεκίνησε ως μια συνεργασία 6 χωρών του Ευρωπαϊκού Νότου, Ιταλία, Ισπανία, Πορτογαλία, Ελλάδα, Κύπρος και Μάλτα, και στη συνέχεια προσθέθηκαν και 3 χώρες της Βαλκανικής, Ρουμανία, Κροατία και Σλοβενία. Όμως, στη φάση που είχαν τεθεί θέματα νομικής θωράκισης αυτής της πρωτοβουλίας για να διασφαλιστεί ότι το αποτέλεσμα της κοινής διαπραγμάτευσης θα ισχύει στο δίκαιο, θα ενσωματώνεται στο εθνικό δίκαιο κάθε χώρας, εκεί υπήρξαν δυσκολίες και έκτοτε κατά κάποιο τρόπο βάλτωσε το πράγμα. Νομίζω ότι τώρα είναι πραγματικά η συγκυρία που πρέπει αυτές τις πρωτοβουλίες να αποκτήσουν σάρκα και οστά. Τώρα είναι η ώρα, η πανδημία έχει θέσει μεγάλες προκλήσεις μπροστά στην ανθρωπότητα. Είναι η ώρα και οι θεσμοί, οι εθνικοί ή οι διεθνείς, οι υπερεθνικοί θεσμοί να σταθούν στο ύψος των περιστάσεων. Αυτό νομίζω ότι είναι η απέτηση των κοινωνιών σε όλο τον κόσμο.
Συμφωνούμε πολύ. Ευχαριστούμε. Thank you very much, Andreas. And at this point, I would like to thank everybody for participating, either as a panelist or as an attendee, and for their questions. And also would like to thank the interpreters and everybody who worked to make this interesting and timely dialogue possible. And give the floor on for the honors of concluding to my dear colleague, Mark Potenka.
Thank you, Petros. I hope you can hear me better now. We had some connection problems with the European Parliament before, so I decided to go home. But thanks, first of all, to all of the speakers. It was, I think, extremely interesting and thought-provoking. First of all, indeed, the strengths and weaknesses of the strategy of the European Union, I think, of the European Commission. The European Commission has often been pointed with the finger and not unrightly so. I think Yanis Natsis explained also a little bit why, but at the same time, let's not forget that member states were there, controlled, checked, and so on. So it's if there is blame, and there certainly is blame, at least from my perspective, it is certainly shared. So because we have, at least in Belgium, and I guess in a number of member states, this habit of where the national or regional governments point to Europe, and then the European Union points back to the national member states. I think this is a first point which I believe is important regarding responsibilities. Secondly, if we look indeed at the strengths and weaknesses, the big strength or the main strength basically comes from common sense, the idea of working together, of negotiating together in front of what are very powerful companies, we know this, that have very often almost monopoly positions, because we speak about free competition, but in this case, free competition is even either very limited or rather inexistent. Now, I think a first weakness clearly, which has been mentioned, is indeed that we have seen this too much as a merely commercial deal. And when I say we, I mean the European Union and the European Commission, not so much our group, I think. Rather than, and it would be interesting indeed, Olivier Hoedeman mentioned it, to see really all of the data, all of the discussions, to see if this statement by Commission President Ursula von der Leyen was just a statement for the public, or was indeed, if they tried within the negotiations but lost, which is something that can happen, of course, in the course of negotiations, or if it was just for public consumption. I think that would be extremely interesting, because obviously, especially in this case, and this is, I think, where there's such a big movement building for some action on intellectual property rights. The question has popped up before. We've had the HIV/AIDS debate, obviously. We've had other examples more recently. But in this pandemic, it is so clear that, how would I say, all of our rights have been limited, are being limited still, and the only right that is still untouched apparently is intellectual property rights. So that is a little bit impossible to explain, even within the framework, I believe, of a merely commercial deal. And so putting aside the fact that we don't think it should have been, even if you look at a commercial deal where starting from massive investments in public research and development, a vaccination strategy, a EU vaccination strategy that explicitly said we want to de-risk investment and development, and then all of the clauses that are guaranteeing indemnification in cases, in certain civil liability cases, that we do not get a package on intellectual property rights that is, even from a commercial perspective, I believe, quite debatable. To compare, the United States, not using them for the moment, but they do have march-in rights. And I think for the future in the European Union, it would be very, very useful to have similar tools as a minimum public safeguard. Because indeed, we can then see that they're not always used and so on. This is a debate I don't want to go into right now, but you can see the difference. You can see the difference also partially, I think, because we are more fragmented, and partially because of an ideological approach. This was said as well, this fixation on they are our partners. This doesn't mean that we should never work with them, but we should not forget that there are different interests at stake. Pfizer is not a health NGO. This is very clear. And we have different objectives. And sometimes we need to speak to each other, we need to work together. At other times, we need to be very clear what the objectives are and if other tools are possible. I thought a very interesting point as well was made by Olivier Hoedeman on the fact how transparency in these negotiations that Yanis Natsis explained could have helped. Because you can see that there is clearly a pressure. The argument of the European Commission was the opposite. It was saying, if we are transparent, then we will get worse prices. I always thought that was very weird, because that's not generally how the market is supposed to work. Especially the first deal they concluded was the cheapest one. Price-wise, the first deal was the cheapest one. So it's not the same vaccine, and we know I'm kind of making a simplification out of it. But still, the point of making, you can have public pressure.
accountability and transparency help in getting better deals is, in my opinion, a fair point. It's not mechanical and so on, but it is a fair point to say more transparency could bring better deals. It is a big choice. It's a big chance, I think, for the European Union and the European Commission. And I think Andres Santos kind of alluded to this as well. Member states working together with an equitable distribution of vaccines as such in such a crisis would have been a great step forward. Because, you know, we have seen what happened in March and April, the first reactions of certain countries blocking medical material and so on and so on. So this would have, and this was a bit the idea behind it officially as well, formally, with the initial alliance of the 4 countries that said we're going to do this, and the Commission taking over, that would have made sense. But if you then see that the negotiation strategy and the end results do not guarantee these 2 countries, then we get the same results or the same reflexes we had at the beginning of this pandemic, with you know, some countries negotiating in parallel, or at least very parallel deals. Other countries now, this was in the news today, trying to get a deal with Israel to see if they cannot get a preferential way to vaccines that way. Still other countries saying, okay, we will allow vaccines that other countries have not yet allowed, and so on. Basically, we get a de-Europeanization, I don't know if that's a word, but a renationalization of purchase agreements. And once again, the competition that's going to play between the countries that have a bigger buying power and others that have less weight. Finally, I mean, obviously this plays at a global level. We've played, you know, I think it's not a good image for the European Union to be seen at the WTO, the World Trade Organization, to impose, basically to block initiatives like the one from India and South Africa. Also from a diplomatic perspective, it's not great. And from a human rights perspective, it's obviously bad. You know, let's be very clear about that. Regarding maybe a point towards the future, I think, and I think it was in the first presentation on what they call the industrialization of health policy, and I think that's it's an interesting point. We're starting to work on the European Pharmaceutical strategy, also in the industry committee. The problem with this is that the objectives of industrial policy are different. This is competitiveness of companies, mainly. I'm summarizing it, but the objective of the European industrial policy is mainly focused on the competitiveness of European companies. If we want a public health-driven health strategy, putting one next to each other is not a good idea. This doesn't mean that we do not need production capacity. This doesn't mean, and so on. We all need this, but the way to get there depends on the final objective you put. And what I would argue would be to say, okay, we need clearly action on the intellectual property rights. We also have the intellectual property strategy that has been published and that we will work on. But this means that we need to move from basically a market-driven model or a profit-driven model to a public health-driven model, where we say public health is the objective. We need this access, we need guarantees, public safeguards, I think Olivier Hoedeman called them. We need to make sure this is better for Europe as such, for the citizens, this is better for the world. And this means we can move from what we are now, our market fixers in a way. Each time that the industry refuses to develop a product, we come with money and we ask them kindly, and they stay the owners, to an active market shaper. Basically, we say, listen, this is what we want. This is what we need from a public health perspective. There's a list. I'm thinking we're speaking about vaccines, but there's a list of essential medicines. There's no reason not to use this list when thinking about a public health strategy or pharmaceutical strategy in the European Union. This exists. I know it's been controversial in different member states, but why not? It's also, I think, good to start thinking about public-public partnerships. They are mentioned very often in one paragraph of the European Commission's paper, but then very often forgotten about. And I think they're important. I think they're important also because I remember this report, and I think it was published by, co-published by CEO by Corporate Europe Observatory. What happened inside the Innovative Medicines Initiative, where industry decides too much what happens to public funds. So I think we should be looking at public-public partnerships and putting innovation at the service of the people, patients, and public health rather than private profits. So, but I think we broadly agree on this. And to be honest, if we want somewhere to move towards a public health Europe where people in Greece, Germany, and other countries are all have equitable access, and then speaking about the rest of the world, to the vaccine, this would be a way forward. But I want to thank you again. I've tried to take some elements from all of the very rich speeches, but I think it was great also the questions. So thanks for all of your input, and Petros for the wonderful introduction and moderation.
So I guess this brings us to the end, and thank you everybody, and looking forward to further cooperation on all the issues and the ombudsman, of course. Thank you very much.